at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies of the European University Institute, and also a co-director of the Global Citizenship Observatory. So in today's webinar, we discuss the topic of dual citizenship, diasporas, and development. And diasporas have often been viewed traditionally as somewhat suspiciously as having abandoned the nation, and as a result, dual citizenship has traditionally been regulated restrictively in many parts of the world. However, expatriate dual citizenship is nowadays accepted in around 3/4 of the world, so has proliferated. And in today's webinar, we discuss some core questions around dual citizenship, diaspora, governance, and development. I'm delighted to have four fantastic speakers in the panel who I will introduce in a moment. But the format of today is a roundtable where we ask each of these speakers a set of 3 questions. So the webinar will go through 3 rounds with questions. And in the first round, we discuss, we try to understand what drives actually this trend of dual citizenship acceptance. So to what extent have diaspora communities pushed for the recognition of their dual citizenship? How have political elites in various geographic and political contexts responded to these calls, including perhaps attempts of a remote control of their diasporas? In other words, how are diaspora communities and political elites driving this trend of dual citizenship acceptance? Then in the second round, we try to understand the consequences of this trend. So we address the question whether dual citizenship does in fact contribute to home country economic and political development. And if so, how? And I'm sure we'll see that this is a complicated question. The causal relations are not so straightforward, but what do we actually know about this? And what are some of the limitations of existing research? Thirdly, in the third round, we try to reflect on the broader consequences for the evolution of global policy environments, and try to understand whether dual citizenship perhaps brings into purview new perspectives on diaspora governance and development. So these are the questions that I would like to discuss today with the panel who you see in front of you. Let me briefly introduce them. I'm really thrilled to have 4 such great speakers from different disciplinary and geographical perspectives. First of all, we have Jen Dickinson. She is a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Winchester. Her research examines the politics of diaspora engagement and is grounded in feminist approaches that engage with diasporic civil society and everyday practices of the state. And her most current research examines everyday lived citizenship of young people from the Rwandan diaspora in the UK. Second, we have David Leblanc. He is a professor of politics at the University of Virginia, as well as a professor of public policy at the Batten School for Leadership and Public Policy, where he directs the Global Policy Center. David, as a scholar in the area of international political economy, has expertise on international immigration, global capital markets, and financial crisis. Thirdly, Daniel Naujok, he is the director ad interim for the International Organization and UN Studies Specialization at Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs. And his research focuses on global governance, migration, refugees, and citizenship in the Global South. And he's the author of Migration, Citizenship, and Development, published with OUP in 2013. Last but certainly not least, we have Rabtel Neajai Paley. She's a Liberian scholar, activist working at the intersection of critical development studies, critical African studies, and critical race studies. And she's an assistant professor in international social and public policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Rabtel is the author of the book that recently came out with Cambridge University Press, Development, Dual Citizenship, and its Discontents in Africa, the Political Economy of Belonging to Liberia. Okay, so thanks again to all 4 of you for being here. We're going to discuss this set of questions with all of you. But let me just say to the audience that besides the speakers, everyone in the audience will have a chance to participate and contribute to our discussion. So if you have any questions or comments that come up during the discussion, please feel free to post your question using the Q&A function in Zoom. preferably indicate whether your question is meant for one speaker in particular or possibly for multiple speakers. And you can post your question as soon as it comes to your mind, and we pick this up in the Q&A, which we will start after the second round of questions. I will collect them and try to address all of these questions to the speakers. Okay, well, I think without further ado, we should jump into the discussion. Start with this first round of questions, and I would like to start by inviting Robtel to share her thoughts, especially on the question of, well, what really drives this process of dual citizenship acceptance around the world, which actually in Africa, Robtel, where you have done a lot of research, the trend seems to be a mixed one, with many, but certainly not all states adhering to this global trend. And Liberia, the country that features in your own research, is a good example probably of that. So how do you see this? What actually are the main grounds for contestation of dual citizenship? Thanks a lot, Robtel.
Sure. Thank you so much, Martin, for the invitation, as well as thank you to GLOBALCIT for organizing this. I also want to give a special shout out to Valentina, who's been incredibly resourceful in driving this process forward with all of her back in the scenes, heavy lifting. So in terms of dual citizenship, I think most of us will agree that there has been a process of dual citizenship diffusion, and it is it's a reality across the globe, with 75% of countries actually recognizing some form of dual citizenship, with some restrictions, of course, more regulations more restrictive than others, depending on the context. And I think quite frequently, rapid migration and globalization processes have made citizenship laws one of the only ways that governments feel that they can assert any sort of control over territory and peoples. And that's people within their geographic territory, but also those who might exist abroad in countries of settlement. Within the context of Africa, debates around dual citizenship in Africa have really been spurred by processes of democratization. This is an argument that Beth Elise Whitaker makes in her 2011 article. She also argues that dual citizenship enactment has been based on perceived sort of political leanings of diasporas. So when diasporas are perceived as threats to politicians, they're less likely to actually enact dual citizenship or endorse dual citizenship passage. In many cases, African political elites face a sort of dichotomy between supporting diasporas on one hand, and in turn extracting political support from them as an important constituency. And on the other hand, fearing direct political competition from diasporas. Now, I'll give two case studies in Africa that I've come across that are really good sort of polar opposites of dual citizenship enactment within the continent. The first is the case study of Senegal, in which dual citizenship enactment has really been a top-down kind of enactment from above process, right? Dual citizenship enactment in Senegal has been instituted since independence in the 1960s by political elites. So for instance, the very first president, post-independence president of Senegal was President Senghor, who held dual Senegalese as well as French citizenship. And as a result, I think Senegal has some of the most liberal dual citizenship regulations in Africa. It enables dual diaspora voting. It enables diaspora representation in parliament. In many cases, that is not necessarily allowed in other countries that have enacted dual citizenship in the past 30 years in the continent of Africa. The other example is Ghana, which is a more bottom-up enactment of dual citizenship from below. Dual citizenship in Ghana was enacted primarily through the advocacy of diaspora communities in the age of what Whitaker calls political liberalization in the 1980s and 90s. Dual citizenship was officially recognized by the Ghanaian state in the mid-1990s, but the implementation actually didn't begin until 2002, again, because of this tussle between political elites and diasporas. In Ghana, there are actual restrictions, unlike Senegal, on immigrants being able to hold public office and voting for now. The president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, did push to enactment of enabling diasporas to hold public office, but that has not necessarily been pushed through in terms of enactment. Now, there were similar delays in Kenya, in East Africa, in which dual citizenship was promised by politicians in 2002, but there was increased agitation from diasporas before dual citizenship was actually embedded in the Constitution of 2010. So again, we see that tussle between political elites and diaspora communities themselves. But I think in the debate around dual citizenship, I think there often is an overemphasis on the tussle between political elites and countries of origin and diaspora communities. When I argue in my book that what we really need to do is move beyond the sort of diaspora-centric or political elite-centric analysis to focus on the resistance from what I call homelanders, so domestic citizens, who actually may view dual citizenship as a zero-sum game, as infringing upon their already very limited access to political, economic, and social rights, and as perhaps even reproducing inequalities. What I argue in my book is that diaspora's citizenship as well as development claims are viscerally contested by homelanders, as much as political elites in countries of origin. In the continent of Africa, there are only 7 countries that do not recognize dual citizenship, that explicitly or categorically prohibit: Cameroon, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Liberia, and Tanzania. I'll end a little bit by giving some insights about Liberia, which is a case study that I delve into quite extensively in my new book. What I realized, and I found out throughout my empirical research, is that in Liberia, diasporas were just as instrumental in pushing for the introduction of a dual citizenship bill in 2008, as homelanders have been incredibly instrumental in blocking the passage of this bill. There have been Afrobarometer surveys conducted in Liberia in 2012 as well as 2018, in which 2/3 of domestic citizens who were surveyed during this process actually were staunchly opposed to dual citizenship. We also had a national referendum in December 2020 in which there wasn't a 2/3 majority vote in order to push forward the proposition on dual citizenship. So I say all of this to argue that it's important to also focus the attention in our public discourse, in our research, in our analysis on ordinary citizens in countries of origin who may have very legitimate reasons for opposing dual citizenship, as much as we do focus on political elites and diaspora communities.
Thanks a lot, Robto. So this is great. So this already gives us actually a lot to chew on, but I'm going to restrain myself. But I think you brought a lot of issues on the table that certainly show the contestation of dual citizenship, right? So let's try to dig this out a bit more. Let me ask David. So in your CTS paper, you spoke, of course, explicitly about harnessing the diaspora, right? Which seems to incorporate this top-down perspective, if we use Robtel's words there, where you argue that dual citizenship is, in a way, allows origin country governments to leverage the economic and human resources of their diaspora. So can you say a bit more about these harnessing dynamics, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I'm both happy and not happy to follow Robtel, because I think her stories are so rich and so richly detailed in a way that I can't even begin to appreciate and comprehend. I'm very much interested in these phenomena in terms of global patterns, and the other reason why I think it's an interesting comparison is because I'm trained as a political scientist, trained as somebody doing international relations, and who sees country behavior through the lens of power, right? Countries are trying to maximize their global power and their reach. And in this regard, I approach understanding diaspora policies as part and parcel of a government attempting to maximize its reach, its global reach, right? That said, it's important to note, and I think this is consistent, Martin, with what you said earlier, and how we think about diaspora groups, is that I try to think about these communities as affinity groups. And it's important to note that affinity has to work in both ways. Sometimes diaspora groups form as populations are forced into exile. And in those cases, the diaspora group may have an affinity for the opposition of the government, while in other times or other cases, the homeland, the government, may have an affinity if they hope or expect to get something out of their relationship. And so, Martin, you asked this question about the supply of and demand for dual citizenship. And I tend to think of it the opposite as a Robtel. I think about this really as a supply side or a top-down mechanism. And I really view the deployment of dual citizenship very instrumentally. right? And there's lots of examples of homeland governments attempting to use or to leverage or to mobilize their diaspora for instrumental purposes, right? They provide their diaspora with rights in exchange for remittances, which we can talk about later, for foreign lobbying. And there's a lot of work here. I've done some work with Sarah Bermeo, where we look at the relationship between diaspora groups and their ability to vote in host countries and their homeland recipients' ability to receive foreign economic assistance. So we can think about Armenia tapping its diaspora in an attempt to lobby for recognition of the, so that they would lobby in the United States for recognition of the Armenian genocide. There's a long and storied discussion of the ways in which Israel taps into religious affinity and stories of a historical promised land, even to tap into the affinity of people who've never even laid foot in that country. Right? The hard part, in my view, is trying to think about a counterfactual, right? So one of the examples that really got me interested in thinking about dual citizenship was, I think it was Yossi Shane, who was talking about the deployment of dual citizenship and external voting rights by countries of Central America in the 1980s. Right, following decades-long bloody civil wars that the United States had been part of. And at the time in the 1980s, the United States was rethinking its citizenship rules, but more importantly, its rules that govern the arrival of refugees and asylum seekers. And so Shane's story is that dual citizenship was extended to Nicaraguans, El Salvadorians, Guatemalans who were in the United States in the hope of leveraging their energy so that they would lobby for more liberal interpretation of United States citizenship rights, especially as they pertain to asylum, right? And so again, I think that's a pretty compelling story. The hard part is thinking about what the counterfactual is. What would these diaspora groups have done absent the extension of dual citizenship? Would they still have had that kind of affinity? And in that regard, what I want to think about, and Martin, what your initial question makes me think about is, this notion of remote control, asking the question, who has power in this relationship? And this is why, again, I like following Robitaille, because the question could be, is it the diaspora that has the power because they are the arm that can engage in lobbying or for foreign aid, or they could remit and send money home? Or is it the government that has the power? Right. And so I think when we look at these different kinds of circumstances, top down versus bottom up, we see a flip of the principal agent relationship in terms of who's controlling whom. And here I don't mean that in a malicious kind of way, right? But who has the power in this principal agent relationship? And I think there's a lot more that we can get into when we think about the country, not just the data on the 75% or maybe 80% of the countries that have extended dual citizenship, but why do we not see some obvious cases, some obvious countries that we would think all else equal would extend dual citizenship and have not? And I'm hoping we'll have some time to talk about that a little bit later on. But thank you, Valentina and Martin, for giving me the opportunity. And I'm really just looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thanks a lot, David, for bringing in this political economy perspective. Yeah, I think we have to come back a bit more to this supply and demand, and also the constraints on this. Let me go to Jen first of all. Actually, Jen, in your political geography paper from a few years ago, you problematized this idea of kind of a centralized state-led transnationalism. So I suppose that yeah, that also comes with a certain critique on looking at this kind of issues only from a top-down perspective. So maybe you can say a bit more about how you, from your research, look at this trend of dual citizenship acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm going to perhaps kind of take a totally different tack to everybody else, but it's kind of partly picking up on Robitaille's point about needing to look to the sort of ordinary engagements with dual citizenship, what ordinary people think about it. And my kind of interest is not what ordinary people in the homeland think, but what ordinary people within sort of diasporic civil society think about dual citizenship. So I think it's, I'm coming from a place where I'm kind of approaching this from the question of the ordinary, the everyday, how it relates to sort of civil society relationships, but then also kind of approaching this in context of communities and diaspora communities who may be sort of second, third, fourth, or even fifth generation diasporas, where for many, diaspora dual citizenship is something that is on how people kind of build particular kinds of individual positions within sort of diaspora communities, even people who would not even necessarily see themselves as diasporic. So there's something I think to say about this, how, you know, dual citizenship itself kind of comes from a position of people with these already existing emotional, symbolic, economic relationships to a homeland. And this is just something, I think it's an assumption that we need to question a little bit, particularly thinking about whether dual citizenship is an effective vehicle for diaspora mobilization, because it really kind of depends on the orientation and nature of people's engagement in homeland politics. Many people just simply do not engage in that level of lobbying or in that level of kind of, you know, trying to build these kind of political connections. So then it kind of, the other aspect that I'm kind of interested in as well is how what is the kind of ordinary experiences of actually applying for dual citizenship, even amongst in those cases where it's offered. And so I'm thinking, for instance, of a really great paper that was looking at overseas citizenship of India, for instance, where it goes into a lot of sort of really detailed description of the bureaucratic processes involved in obtaining dual citizenship or overseas citizenship of India, including things like, you know, how they time their application, the ways in which it kind of constitutes a particular performance of national identity and politics, the ways in which people have to follow particular kind of rules and provide particular sets of paperwork, which then can kind of, you know, engender feelings of frustration and feelings of dissent around it as well. So that I think that can kind of call into question the relevance, as I said, you know, of dual citizenship for many people who may not necessarily identify them in this way. So, and I think diasporic civil society is a really important venue for trying to kind of, you know, tussle over some of these questions about the relevance of dual citizenship. It's, you know, the ways in which people relate to each other through different kinds of networks, the ways in which, for instance, you know, organizations and groups become sort of, you know, they can in many ways like embody the state as they try to kind of engage, for instance, younger generation in responding to and connecting to these particular kinds of demands. So what I'm kind of interested in is not the people who want the citizenship. I'm interested in the people who don't, and then what that also kind of says for these homeland relationships.
Thanks a lot, Jen, for bringing in also this, the importance of this subjective perspective. Indeed, yeah, we might assume that this is always a desirable good, which from different experiences may be very different. Well, you already actually made a little bridge to Daniel. So let me bring you in, Daniel, since you have done a lot of work on the Indian case, in fact, and the Indian diaspora in the US in particular. And actually, India is one of these cases where dual citizenship, at least legally and politically, has remained contested. Jen also already mentioned the OCI status, which is an alternative to dual citizenship, some kind of quasi-citizenship. Actually, recently that was introduced already some years ago, but recently the rights that come with OCI have actually been curtailed. So this seems to indicate that there is a lot of stuff going on there, at least politically, around acceptance of dual citizenship. So what are your views on yeah, what drives this trend and especially the contestation of dual citizenship, Daniel?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks everybody for these really enlightening thoughts. And I've been taking notes, and it's very, very interesting to hear these different perspectives that tie in, I think, very much with what I have to say. So my original research project for like 10 years ago was mostly on OCI, Overseas Citizenship India. I did 5 years of field work in India, and I believe I have a few things learned from that. though my current focus is mostly on other things, but I keep a foot in the citizenship construction ideas. So of the 5 years I spent in India, I spent about 3 years trying to figure out what exactly, the policy analysis of dual citizenship and OCI. And so I used to be just a lawyer. I became an economist, and then I wanted to do a PhD in political science, which ended up more a political sociology piece in the end. So as a political scientist, I thought, oh, I have to do policy analysis. So I have to find out what drives policies. And for anybody who's really interested, not just writing about it, but actually understanding what drives policy, it's one of those most horrible questions. I can strongly discourage you from trying to attempt this, because if you really want to understand what prompted the policy, it's at the narrative level, it's super easy. You go to parliamentary debates, you analyze statements from politicians. I had 70 interviews with foreign ministers, interior ministers, a lot of important people. But to actually know, and like David pointed, the power dynamics, right, even with the internal system, it's really, really hard to put your finger on what policy entrepreneur at what point reacted to what statement and what pressure. So it's very easy in policy science. We often think about ideas as hooks, right? Often there are people say, oh yeah, that's about human rights, that's about gender, that's about diaspora. But the actual reason they're doing it is hidden. So if you actually want the real reason, it's really, really tricky to get that in most cases. So in India, things changed in about 1999. The Indian government had first introduced a person of Indian origin card, which was meant to actually satisfy the demand for dual citizenship. It didn't, for good reason. Nobody took the card. It was really expensive. It was not a good process. And it doesn't give you a permanent visa. It was not a very successful attempt. And then in 2003, the government came in and said, okay, we'll give citizenship to 8 specific countries. No, I say dual citizenship, but what it actually is overseas citizenship. I go in a moment into what that means. And they justified reducing it to these countries by demand. So that's to one extent what Martin was saying about what is the role of diaspora communities. And they felt, and they had a large committee that went around the world in 2001, 2002, the high-level committee on the Indian diaspora, led by a famous lawyer, constitutional lawyer, and had 3 other members. And they went around the world and listened to diaspora communities. And based on that, they felt in these 8 countries, mostly Western European countries, there is a demand. People actually wanted. And the second criterion for limiting to these 8 countries was acceptance in the country of destination or country of residence. They said in South Africa, the Indian communities after apartheid, after being in the buffer between the white regime and the black majority, the Indian community always felt in a difficult situation. If now they had dual citizenship, they felt that it would be very easy to expel them. So these people said, please don't. These changes actually never saw, they were adopted in the Citizenship Act of 2003, but not a single card was issued. In 2005, the new government came in and they completely changed the legislation and now made it open to all countries in the world. And that's the legislation we still have, more or less. What led to this entire process of embracing the diaspora was not just limited to citizenship. Citizenship was just one tool, a very convenient tool to communicate. And I get later to that when we talk about the effects of dual citizenship. But I would say the major reason for adopting dual citizenship or this attempt of dual citizenship was to appease the diaspora and as a PR tool to engage them. There was, in economic terms, in cultural policies, in home policies, in foreign policies, huge changes happened over the course of 20, 30 years, both in India and within the diaspora communities. Existence of now the US diaspora, very rich diaspora, very like, we are proud of you diaspora, not just the old Fijian Indians and the Malaysian Indians who were considered problem children because there was always conflict and they were more a struggle for India than seen as a benefit, right? So a lot of changes in both in India. India now became more self-confident, right? India not being seen as land of the poor and snake charmers, but now India being seen as the country of IT, of intelligent people, of export highly skilled labor. So these changes led overall to a switch from what I call a traitor tune to a pride paradigm. And excuse my love for alliterations. Or from an invisible diaspora, where you ignore the diaspora, to a diaspora empire. If you analyze the patterns of narratives, now everybody talks about the diasporas everywhere, the big family, and we're all so proud, and you're doing great there, and then you're doing great here, and this mutual self-assurance actually led to a place where, okay, now we have to do something. The funny thing is that the diaspora always wanted full dual citizenship. And I know many people who have conventions, they represent organizations that have the claim of representing the diaspora. Again, we can talk about also what it means to be representing the diaspora, right? It's a very problematic idea. India found very strangely a way around having to give dual citizenship. The political system always said, oh, our constitution doesn't allow it. And there's two funny things about it. I think funny. The first thing, of course, you can change the constitution, right? Many countries have changed them, but for some reason, everybody blindly said, okay, if it's there. And what's even funnier is the constitution doesn't say that. An untrained person reading the constitution may read the constitution as saying that, but it just said in the beginning in 48, when the constitution was, on 51, when the constitution was made and the transition from British India to the Republic of India, at that point, nobody could have a dual citizenship, which had to do with India, with Pakistan and India. So they wanted to have a real separation of these two countries. But the constitution is completely agnostic about dual citizenship, but it's still one of those beat me dead arguments that everybody buys. India, there's no political rights, right? And even for actual citizens, non-resident Indians, there are no political rights, or as good as no political. Again, we talk about that. There have been some amendments, and they are supposed to be coming more, but it's almost no one in the diaspora actually has political rights. The rights in India associated with overseas citizenship, even though itself was incorporated in the Citizenship Act, not a single benefit or right, or when you call them, is incorporated in the citizenship law. All the benefits are entirely given by ministerial notifications, which can be revoked at any given time. So from a citizenship point of view, I mean, I published an article last year in comparative citizenship studies on atypical citizenship, where I compare British overseas citizenship, OCI, and European citizenship. So on the last note, while India embraced a citizenship narrative, and India did, and to Jen's point, how is it perceived? In the next question, I think I have a few insights on how it is perceived by diaspora individuals. The framing was always legal citizenship. But the actual content, how it is transposed into the practicalities, it's not citizenship. So it's a very interesting way of trying to eat your cake and have it too.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Before we go to the next round, maybe to push this discussion on one point. So I wanted to come back to the point that Rob Tell mentioned of democratization, right? So the argument that Whitaker makes in her paper on right, that there's an association between democratization and dual citizenship extension, right? And yeah, that seems to me an interesting argument, but it's also complicated in the sense that right, in as far as citizenship comes with voting rights, and in as far as a country has external voting, that means that yeah, there are votes to win, but there's also potential political opposition to be invited, right? And that may not be always welcome. But just to push Daniel on this point, so this recent change by the Modi government, you see this in the context of because from what I understood, the curtailing of these rights that come with OCI is very much linked to the supposedly more vocal diaspora that uses OCI status to come back to India. Right? So did I understand that correctly, Daniel?
So it's very interesting how the Indian discourse, the policy discourse on overseas citizenship have shifted. In the very beginning, in parliamentary analysis, like from 2003 and 2005, the only term used by every single speaker was dual citizenship. Nobody would use overseas citizenship or anything. They always use dual citizenship. At some point, when you follow the discussion, it then becomes, oh, this is not dual citizenship. This is something else. Then they call it overseas citizenship card. And it was related kind of to what the expectations were. If you look at also, there was from the beginning a threat of security. Like if you give just blanket visas to people, you don't really scrutinize them, but you by the way do scrutinize them. That's like for all of these processes, there is a kind of a scrutiny, but there was an idea that people can come and do whatever they want. And India has always been very reluctant about foreign influence for good reason. And in the 70s, the CIA, because India was head of the non-alignment movement, right? So the CIA and others were very trying to influence it. So India was very scared or worried about influence from abroad. And the diaspora was to some extent included in that. So when they opened it up first, they thought, oh, OCI will just come here. They will just visit their family. If you really talk to people, they just talked about, oh, maybe some investors that come quickly. They will not really live here. They won't do stuff. The more people then actually came, lived there, and by the way, at some point, they canceled the PIO, the personal religion card, and opened overseas citizenship to people like me, people married to Indian citizens. My wife is Indian. So I am actually an overseas citizen. I'm also a person of Indian origin. That's not a cultural appropriation. I'm legally speaking a person of Indian origin by Indian law. And so it's more people actually used it and also became vocal, right? Then the ministry said, oh, wait a moment. And the current ministry had a government under Modi has done a lot of things that a democratic global government should not do, like their own citizens and of curtailing their rights, etc. So in an easy way where you have this ministry, just like I can form this the way I want. And with the perception that a lot of the diaspora, especially the vocal diaspora in the US and UK, right, they're much more politically vocal, often are, for some reason, I don't know why, often Modi supporters. They can do that without having a huge backlash. So that's I think the reason why they changed it even less towards citizenship and more towards visa.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to bring in one question from the audience here, actually, to Robtel, because I wanted to push you a bit more on the democratization that you mentioned in your first intervention. So there's actually a question by Rainer Baubach about what motivates Homelander opposition to dual citizenship for diasporas. Is it that the diaspora is regarded as being out of touch, as supporting irresponsible policies that in the homeland that will not affect them, or just an instrumental tool for homeland politicians to prop up their power through external votes? So can you say a bit more, Robtel, maybe on this dynamic between dual citizenship acceptance and political dynamics?
Sure, thank you for the question. When I was specifically speaking about opposition from homelanders, it was within the context of the research I've conducted in Liberia. And I think it's important, like the Liberia case study is important because it's a post-war country of emigration. And I fundamentally believe that dual citizenship is perceived and received in immigration states, perhaps differently than emigration states. And dual citizenship is perceived and received differently from in countries where there's an experience of some sort of political upheaval or violence, like armed conflict that Liberia experienced for 14 years, and countries that may never have experienced that sort of political upheaval. So within the context of Liberia, I'll give two examples. In chapter 6 of my book, I talk about something called the Taylor-Corcoram Nexus. There were diasporas in the 1980s and the 1990s that were viscerally anti-government. So much so that they got involved in actually fomenting armed conflict in the country. For instance, diaspora communities raised money, large amounts of money for rebel factions to invade the country and to wreak havoc for 14 years. There's a particular diasporic kind of icon of what they might term the Janus face of diasporas, called Charles Taylor, who is in a Hague court or a British court at a British prison at the moment for aiding and abetting rebels in Sierra Leone. But Charles Taylor was a very, very notorious rebel leader who became president of Liberia. During his diasporic advocacy and lobbying in the United States, he was asked to come back to work for the government of Liberia in the General Services Agency. Allegedly, he stole about $1 million from the General Services Agency and then flew to the United States, his adopted home. Many argue that he had US citizenship. That hasn't been proven empirically yet, but he definitely had permanent residency. So a lot of people hark back to this, evoke this sort of Taylor experience of a very tactile experience of Liberians in the diaspora wreaking havoc, fomenting armed conflict, and not necessarily experiencing the consequences of that. The other example of that Taylor-Corcoram nexus that I bring up in chapter 6 is Corcoram, Ellen Corcoram, who is a US citizen Army pilot of Liberian parentage, who was asked by the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration in 2011 to come back and work in aviation reforms, given her experience in the aviation sector in the United States. She was alleged to have stolen about $1 million from the aviation agency in Liberia and then flew to the United States. Liberia's been trying to extradite her for almost 10 years now and hasn't been able to do that in terms of making sure that she sees the full weight of the law. Again, this is an alleged attempt to steal money from the national coffers. There have been so many tactile experiences that homelanders have seen themselves and experienced themselves and said, wait a second, these people don't really have any sort of vested interest in political stability in the country. They have no vested interest in economic stability in the country. So why should we then extend and open up at a Pandora's box for them to have dual citizenship, given that we don't even have an enacted dual citizenship bill, and this is already happening, right? So I think there are legitimate, concrete, empirical, tactile fears that people on the ground have. The other example I want to make is I use a term in the book that I coined. So if anybody's going to use this term, make sure that you reference me, of diaspocracy. And a diaspocracy is effectively a government in power that has overwhelmingly large numbers of people in very strategic ministries and agencies who are running the affairs of the state. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from 2006 until 2018 effectively ran a diaspocracy. So people like me, what homelanders might call returnees or importees, were at the very top in terms of the political echelons, running things, not really necessarily being in touch with the experience of those who stayed during the war. So you have these sort of two examples of homelanders saying, well, why should we allow a diaspocracy to continue? If we enable dual citizenship, this is precisely what's going to happen. And why should we continue to allow a Taylor-Corcoram nexus to continue to reproduce itself? So I give these very concrete examples to show that people on the ground as homelanders have very legitimate reasons for resisting dual citizenship.
Thanks a lot, Robtel, for your additional thoughts on these, the complicated political dynamics of dual citizenship. So we have already a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I want to go first to the second round of questions that I wanted to raise with the speakers. But for people in the audience, feel free to post additional questions in the Q&A, which also the speakers can see, so then they can already reflect on that a bit, and we come back to that after the next round. Yeah, let's go to the second bunch of questions, which has to do with what happens when we open this Pandora's box of dual citizenship. And I wanted to start with David, right? So, and then we are going to talk more about the effects of dual citizenship, right? So these are all big questions, right? What drives dual citizenship? What are the effects of it? So we're only giving people a taste of this, but yeah, I wanted to push you a bit on this, David. So yeah, on this question of the effects of dual citizenship, and especially the mechanisms, right? So in as far as there are certain relations between dual citizenship extension and political and economic development, and you have mostly looked at, in your CPS paper, for example, you looked at remittances and return migration, right? And you observed that the dual citizenship encourages both remittances and return migration. So maybe you could say a bit more, David, about how do you see the, in a way, the causal link between this? So what do you think are the mechanisms between dual citizenship and certain development outcomes?
Yeah, no, I should say it's a good question, but it's also, I think it's a good question because that's the question I address in my research, right? So thank you for asking me to talk about my work. Let me first say, however, that with regard to political development, I have a little difficulty in kind of sorting out empirically what we know about political remittances. You know, I find Peggy Levitt's work on social remittances extraordinarily compelling. You know, I think she's right in lots of ways. I have trouble kind of thinking about, again, both counterfactual, but also how to approach that in a more analytical way. With regard to economic development, however, I'm fairly comfortable saying that my answer is an unqualified yes, that dual citizenship has a positive impact on homeland economic development. And this works in at least two ways, Martin. This is what you referenced in the question. And I think this will help get at some of the mechanisms. First is that it does encourage or allow for return migration and or circular migration. I'm loath to use the term return migration these days. I think what we think we know about migration is that a lot of it is circular, especially if we're thinking about, well, I should say across skill levels, right? It's circular, and among high skilled, the use of dual citizenship, I think, is to encourage more circularity. Right, to encourage migrants to return home. And the key here is that dual citizenship means that an expat can keep her home country passport, which by itself eases transaction costs associated with travel home. They don't need to get a visa in order to return home for an extended period of time. And when migrants return, they come home with capital, right? They embody human capital in terms of knowledge, skills, and contacts that they've acquired abroad, right? And they come home with money, right, with hard currency. And whether they come home with it or whether they send it home, I find in my work that dual citizenship increases remittances dramatically. As I said in the answer to the first question, I view dual citizenship as, you know, an articulation, an illustration of affinity. Right, that we are going to try and make it as easy for you to return home, as easy for you to own property at home. And we want to make it clear that you are attached to us, whether you sit in this country or not. Again, the Irish experience, the Israel experience are great examples of trying to exploit, leverage an emotional connection to homeland, right? And dual citizenship is an important part of that by saying that even though you've left, you are still one of us. You still belong to us. You're part of our imagined community, our affinity group. And my research shows that adoption of dual citizenship increases remittances, full stop. Right, there's micro level evidence based on a large number of surveys that says that dual citizenship increases the marginal probability of remitting by about 13%. And at the macro level, all else equal, countries with dual citizenship receive between 29 and 35% more remittances as a share of GDP than countries that do not provide dual citizenship. I'm doing some work now with a graduate student, Ben Helms, and we are finding that it's dual citizenship actually that does the work here. It's not the existence of diaspora institutions a la Alan Gamlin, and it's not the existence of external voting rights, right? And so what this leads us to believe is that we think the mechanism is the ability to have and to hold that passport, the ability to come home, right? And the reason why we find that so compelling is because, you know, again, we can take a step back and talk about remittances, right? The work on remittances, we don't know what the conclusion is, right? We don't know why people remit, right? You know, there's one set of arguments that say people do it because they feel like there's an obligation to repay a debt, an investment that their family has made in them that allows them to go overseas, or they're investing with the prospect of returning home and spending that money or investing that money. Difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish between those two incentives. But what matters, observationally, is that remittances are either investments in their family's current consumption or an investment in the returnee's future consumption, right? And in that regard, it doesn't really matter what the motivation is, dual citizenship increases those remittances. And again, we can have a conversation about whether remittances are good or bad, right? And there's a literature out there about, you know, good things and bad things. I'm going to leave that aside, because at the end of the day, what matters in terms of the stuff that we're doing is that remittances increases value for the household, right? That could be good for the country. It could increase corruption, decrease corruption. I don't know, right? But at the household level, what dual citizenship does is it increases the marginal amount of funds that are remitted to the household. Okay. The other part here, and this is something that again I'm working on with Ben Helms, but I think some of the work that Daniel has been doing. And I don't know if he's going to talk about it, but he circulated or released some stuff yesterday, right? That leads me to believe that there might be a relationship between dual citizenship and incentives for investment abroad. I don't want to steal Daniel's thunder, so I'll leave that aside for right now. And if he doesn't speak to it, maybe we can get to it when we talk, as a group. But again, at the end of the day, what I find is that dual citizenship is an instrument that governments use in order to harness the intellectual and the financial power of their diaspora, right? And in large measure, it's because it makes the ease of return relatively costless, or I should say the cost relatively costless.
Thanks a lot, David, for clarifying your ideas about these mechanisms and indeed pointing especially to the mobility element, I suppose, of dual citizenship. And we can come back to indeed some of these questions. I was reading also we can come back to, for example, social remittances. Again, I was reading actually one of Daniel's pieces this afternoon, where he was also frowning on a bit on that relation. So we can come back to that later. But I wanted to move to Jen first. So how do you look at these relations in terms of the consequences of dual citizenship, given that, as you argued in your first intervention, that actually, what dual citizenship means can be very subjective. So I suppose that also means that it becomes more difficult to make assumptions about potential political or economic payoffs of dual citizenship. So how do you see this? Are you comfortable at all in talking about, let's say, effects of dual citizenship status, Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a few kind of thoughts about it. I mean, I'm coming from this position where I'm always kind of questioning what kinds of development does dual citizenship actually make possible? Whose interest is this in? And then how is also the state sort of using dual citizenship arrangements to distinguish between different kinds of immigrants, different kinds of diaspora groups, all of which generate different kinds of responsibilities and expectations around dual citizenship on the part of the diaspora, but also on the part of the state as well. So what the diaspora expects from the state. So a starting point for me is thinking about the ways in which dual citizenship has kind of evolved to come into being. Most of us here, I think, would acknowledge that diasporas have always played a role in developing homelands in ways that predate the advent of any of these formal tools, such as dual citizenship. So diasporas have always been part of these ideological projects in shaping, resurrecting, reshaping their homelands, which of course is never neutral, it's never politically neutral. So for instance, if we look to India as an example, there's very clear linkages between diaspora fundraising and also the growth of right-wing politics in India, which is also leading to the development of new kind of urban centres, which then is resulting in different kinds of displacement. So for me, dual citizenship is a very specific way of formalising this set of expectations and responsibilities around development. So the answer about whether it contributes or not depends on a way in whether citizenship is something that might be thought to be active or something that may be passive. So if it's passive, this is just, it could be just a public recognition of membership without necessarily leading to any sort of kind of action. So all of these kind of are involved in collectively potentially shaping the future of that nation. And again, kind of thinking through some of the different acts or practices in Engin Aysin's term that citizenship enables, is, kind of thinking about this as kind of constructing a relationship with a very specific set of people or a very specific set of diasporas, who then come to bear the responsibility for certain types of development. Although remittances are usually the focus, in my recent research where I'm looking at the relationship between dual citizenship and entrepreneurship, and again, I'm not stealing Daniel's thunder at all, but just to kind of say that that's increasingly a strategy in particularly African contexts where entrepreneurship is the desired mode of development. And having citizenship and the specifically tightly circumscribed set of regulations around it makes certain things possible. It allows people to be involved in particular processes that they might have not been involved in before. But I also see the potential of this for increasing vulnerability and even potentially exacerbating inequality, which we can kind of witness in, you know, the ways in which cities across South and Southeast Asia are being transformed by being parts of these circuits of private diaspora capital, which are promoting and catalyzing and, you know, these urban landscapes, and then kind of consequently generating particular kinds of displacement. Just as well to pick up on a point that Robtel made, I think we need to be aware in some contexts about how dual citizenship is being used to capture the state, the ways in which diaspora elites are using these kind of modes in order to then kind of remake the state as a space for diasporic elites to run. So for me, you know, there's no doubt that tools such as dual citizenship have enabled development, but I think there's really fundamental questions we need to ask about what kind of changes are being made, in whose interests these are, and as well as some of the consequences that are potentially emerging around sharpening inequality, as I kind of feel like dual citizenship has become this tool in a way for like the creation of these new transnational circuits of capital.
Thanks, Jen. Maybe to push you on one point, so just to satisfy my curiosity. So how do you see this play out among what we might call the second generation or the youngsters, right? Since you mentioned that you are looking specifically at youngsters, is this something that is less relevant for them or more, or are there any particular dynamics here?
Yeah, so one thing I'm finding really interesting in my research project that I'm looking at the moment with Rwandan young people in the UK is that there's a kind of set of like moral responsibilities and engagement around making a contribution. And for the Rwandan state, that looks very specifically at the transfer of skills, transfer of knowledge, investment, and, you know, entrepreneurship. But for the young people that I've been working with, that's not what they're interested in. Actually, they want to make a contribution, but in a way that is not about kind of feeding into these economic narratives. They want to connect with young people in Rwanda. They want to support grassroots social projects. Yeah, of course, there's an element of them that are kind of interested in these kind of more business aspects, but for many of them, it's just about kind of, you know, being able to feel like they're making a difference in a very ordinary way. So that means that dual citizenship is not something that's necessarily relevant to them.
Thanks, Jen. Let me move to Daniel. So already a couple of things were thrown on your plate, actually, but I wanted to ask you a bit more also about mechanisms, about the effects between dual citizenship and remittances, for example, right? Since in your 2020 paper, you also introduce a typology of possible effects, and you also discuss this in your book, and you distinguish there between, in a way, positive effects and negative effects, right? So we might look at this from a positive perspective, in the sense that dual citizenship encourages naturalization abroad, right? So if Indians naturalize in the US, that gives them a bonus, so they actually have more potential money to send back, let's say. That's how I see it. And also negatively, if there's no dual citizenship, they might lose the ties to their home country, right? So can you say a bit more about how do you see what do you see as the most important mechanism here?
Thanks, Martin. And I'm not pleased neither with David or Jen for thinking I have any thunder to offer. Like, now the bar is high, and I think I am no thunder. Like my son's drum, I'm feeling I should get it and bang. So the audience is not disappointed with my elaborations, but I'll try to add some thoughts on when I started researching my book, there was lots of, in the dual citizenship debates, dual citizenship increases remittances. And my starting point then, it was like 15 years ago, is that why? Like, why would me as a state giving you citizenship make you remit more money, right? It's like it's not at the same level. One is the state level, and the other one is like remittances are not sent to the state, right? So that was the actual starting point of my elaborations when I spent these 5 years in Delhi, and then I wrote up my first book. So that was really trying to understand the link between status passages from Indian citizenship to US citizenship, from US citizenship to overseas citizenship. And my question then was, how does it matter for diaspora investment, for remittances, for philanthropy, for political lobbying, for diaspora tourism, for return migration, for all these areas? So, and I published a few things, like my book, of course, tries to like have chapters in all the things I just mentioned. Then in 2018, I had a special article on political lobbying, like how lobbying in the United States, like by the Indian lobby, how is this influenced by the presence of OCI? And then last year, again, a specific part came out on from passports to pennies. In remittance reviews, how exactly this is the impact. And so David is the great quantitative researcher, so he can actually put data together. What I did a grounded theory study, so it's much more qualitative. I try to conceptualize this, so generate hypotheses. So I can't give you the actual effect, but I can tell you what my thoughts are on trying to understand the effects. My underlying framework was that if people do things, they act, such as they remit or they return or they invest or they give money, this depends on whether they can, whether they decide to, and whether they're allowed to act. We're looking to my ability, decision, permissibility, or ADAPT model. And I came up with 4 effects. So further, the rights effect. Citizenship, and you don't have to go back to Hannah Arendt, to all the people in the audience who are citizenship studies, of course, know, who very famously said citizenship is the right to have rights in a different context, but as citizenship scholars, we like that quote. So citizenship is at the core conferment of rights. Right? And what you do with these rights, then giving agency to the diaspora, so they can, as David said, they can just return, they can invest, etc., is one of the key things that the diaspora citizenship does. The second is people know about rights, and the rights effect is also in most diaspora settings, and I can definitely talk about India. There's so many misconceptions about what you are allowed to do, you can't. Like legally, you can think, no, that's actually not correct. But people, all you think, oh, you need this. In India, used to have a so-called the permit Raj, where for everything you needed, like it was a socialist country, right? For everything you need a permit. So it's still, from a bureaucratic point of view, not a very liberal country. So in this complicated system, where you have, for example, many different circulars by the Reserve Bank on the Foreign Exchange Amendment Act, FEMA, on different things in where you can invest, who define, it's really hard, even for an expert let alone for a normal diaspora, an educated diaspora person, right? So having this blanket conferment of rights is one of the key areas. The second one, and I think Jen mentioned that, like what I was very interested in, what I call the identity effect. So how do status passages towards citizenship actually affect your belongingness, and how does these effective feelings actually induce or change the way you return or remit? It's very complicated because we don't understand the psychology of identity very well. And I've done now many studies on that. I'm always surprised how little we know about identity. Like even people who actually study identity much more than I do. At least that's my impression. There's a Sri Lankan saying that says, fish don't talk about the water. So the question is, if you're in India and you look Indian, you're phenotypically Indian, how does citizenship status actually matter? Like when do you use it? And in my interviews, actually, it shows that some people felt the right now to say I'm Indian. If someone says, oh, you're American, whatever, say, no, I have the right to be Indian. There's definitely an emotive element that, especially for those who return to live in India, which then has an impact or can have an impact on how they interact, their willingness to engage more, etc. The third effect is a naturalization effect. So what happens if people naturalize in the US? And I've shown, like, and in our internal discussion we had in the group before, David mentioned a very famous paper by our colleague Michael Jones Correa. Was one of the big papers on arguing that dual citizenship led to higher naturalization. Actually, methodologically speaking, sorry, Michael Jones Correa, I'm a big fan of your work, but that was problematic. I've done other calculations. It's very hard to disentangle certain effects, but overall, we think that dual citizenship increases naturalization. Naturalization then can have different effects, also negative effects. You may actually think you get dual citizenship, naturalization first in the US, and then you return at some point. But if something happens when you become a citizen, and that's really, for me, as someone who's very critical about legal identities and of the nation state, I'm always surprised how my interviews tell me what changed when they took the oath. For so many of my interviewers, really, taking the oath and now meant that they would shed their blood, as the oath says, for their country of adoption, right? So a lot of things actually change in this process, in the lead up and the process in terms of self-identification. So some of these things may actually be a negative on remitting, on returning. And even though the rights are there, the key things is how are different people actually impacted by these. So what I do in my book, in my article, it's more a theoretical framework, but to understand how many of these different groups, I spell different groups out, how affected in different way is really important. And the last effect is the Goodwill Effect. So that's actually many people who are don't take citizenship themselves, feel that now this PR by the state saying, oh, we embrace you and we give you dual citizenship, seems to work, right? And one of the key things that my assessment of dual citizenship, but also many diaspora policies, and I've examined diaspora policies in many other countries, citizenship mostly in India, I think the most important effect is performative, right? No country that I know has ever done an actual evaluation of these policies, a cost-benefit analysis. There's some others that would lend themselves more in diaspora investments. And David mentioned that yesterday came out a short piece of mine in diaspora investment, something I worked on in Senegal, in many other countries. We know so little and so many naive assumptions about diaspora investments, about just the love of the country, etc., which is not really the case. So my last point is about quantitative analysis. Like all those in the audience who like try to run some regressions on that, the real problem, maybe David and his co-workers can find a way around that, but we really don't know. And I've seen any work that tries to disentangle factors that lead to dual citizenship. Like many people may be more inclined to take, let's say, overseas citizenship because they have an interest in India. And it's not, and that's why they in the end will invest more on return, and not necessarily that dual citizenship itself then led to higher in remittances, etc. So these two, like the correlation and the causation is really, really hard to find out in most data. But I look forward to hearing more from you guys.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Okay, we'll throw that back to David on his plate later to share his thoughts on teasing out these various elements. But first going to Robtel. Right, so we talked earlier about the contestation of dual citizenship. Now looking at it the other way around, how do you see this, in terms of the effect of dual citizenship, for example, in the African context, where you said already earlier that there is some variation, right? So the majority of countries accept it, but there's still quite a couple of countries where this is not legally accepted. So would it be possible to see any effect of this, or is that too complicated to disentangle?
Yeah, honestly, I'll have to say that the jury is still out on this one in terms of correlation versus causation. My research actually, which is based on over 200 interviews I conducted in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the US, and the UK, really interrogates this sort of presumed symbiotic relationship between development and dual citizenship. In my research, what I discovered was that dual citizenship is viscerally contested as a development intervention. So people ask questions about what does development mean within the context of amelioration, so betterment, or in some cases that could mean degeneration, especially if it's a type of neoliberal development. So I agree with Jen in that respect in terms of really interrogating what do we mean by development when we say development in quotation marks. What I've come across in terms of really interesting research around remittances is an article that was written by Munir Siaple, who's a former Liberian government official in the finance ministry, who argues that, or he's posited that dual citizens from West Africa, within the sub-region of West Africa, have a higher propensity to send remittances to countries of origin, although he does not claim causation. But another scholar that I've come across by the name of Eheduru has argued that dual citizenship enactment is really more about strategically harnessing immigrant resources to compensate, in many cases, overcompensate for weak government fiscal capacities. And I came across this during one of my interviews with a former finance minister who said to me, Robtel, you know what, honestly, we are really grateful to Liberians who send money from abroad because it enables us to sort of abdicate our responsibility. We don't necessarily have to think about investing in healthcare. We don't necessarily have to think about investing in education. We don't necessarily have to think about building roads, feeder roads. We don't necessarily have to think about all of these issues that we'd probably be confronted by domestic citizens much more intensely if their diasporic family members were not sending this money. So the big question I have is, to what extent do remittances, for instance, within the context of correlating remittances with dual citizenship enactment, enable states to then abdicate their responsibility to citizens? So I'll just leave it there, but I wanted us to just provoke that by ending with that point made by a former finance minister.
Thanks a lot, Robtel. So we have a couple of questions already in the Q&A, a couple for Robtel to come back to. Yeah, there's a more general question by Agnes Laatje, which I wanted to maybe put on David's plate about, she asked, government or top intentions for introducing dual citizenship might not come true as citizens instrumentalize this legal status for socioeconomic status, prestige, or travel. Do you see that it's a possible catalyst for restricting access to dual citizenship again? I'd say if I maybe reformulate this question a bit, if you talk about the mechanisms of the effects of dual citizenship on remittances, if indeed people use this very instrumentally, so only get the status, but actually maybe use this only, let's say, relatively infrequently as a mobility instrument, should we really expect this to have, let's say, major substantial consequences, David? And maybe while you have the floor, I wanted to put the question that Daniel also tabled on the table in terms of effects. Yeah, the naturalization effect, you actually did not talk so much about this, right? So you argue that it's mostly the mobility aspect of dual citizenship, but maybe it's actually mostly the fact that dual citizenship encourages destination country naturalization that has, some of these payoffs. I would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so Martin, you're asking a question that I don't know how to answer, in the sense of, it's hard, if not impossible, to see how many people are utilizing the benefit of having dual citizenship, right? I mean, I think it's a matter of, from a qualitative perspective, the interviews that I've seen and the qualitative cases that I've read are suggestive, but not demonstrative of the fact that dual citizenship is useful, especially if we're thinking about this through the lens of I was going to say high skilled, but I don't want to say high skilled generically, right? People who have gone abroad for very specific kinds of purposes. But there we get into what Jen and Robtel both mentioned, which is there may be underlying intention to go abroad for short term anyway, right? Or to make these investments at home, regardless of the status of dual citizenship. So it's hard for me at least, to know whether or not the power of dual citizenship in terms of mobility decreases over time. What I think we can look at, and I'll admit that I went looking at this right before our seminar, so I would be able to say something intelligent about it, and then I didn't get finished, is Martin, I went back to look at your data, right? To look at countries that had moved backwards, right? So countries that had been allowing dual citizenship and then began to restrict, to see what the consequence of that was in terms of observationally what we can measure in terms of remittances or investment. And I just didn't get finished doing that before the seminar began. But that's something that I would look at, and then not make a causal claim, but certainly make the argument that these things go together. Let me make one last point. Robitel closed with I think a statement that on the one hand could be somewhat controversial, but I don't really think it is. This idea that governments really try and encourage remittances because it allows them to be held harmless in a sense by constituents, and I agree 100%. I think this can be thought of as part of the rationale for why we see the supply of dual citizenship. Right, if governments provide dual citizenship and that does increase remittances, then they can be held harmless in terms of having to provide public goods, right? Because households can provide these goods privately, right? And so policymakers are doing themselves a political service by providing these sets of rights to external populations, again, presuming that it does bring home the investment dollars or the remittance dollars. That may be bad for development overall. Again, that's a different conversation.
Thanks a lot, David. I wanted to bring in a couple of questions from the audience, and there are questions from Bronwyn Mandy and Amanda Klejkowski for Robitel. So maybe you could share your thoughts on the questions of Bronwyn and Amanda, Robitel. So Bronwyn asks about, in a way, when we talk about dual citizenship, is it really about having the documents or only being entitled to the sets of documents? And Amanda also asked a clarification in a way relating to the use of the term homelander. So she is intrigued by your use of that term, and it's a term that Amanda has otherwise seen most often used by a specific group of overseas Americans, those who feel particularly aggrieved by the taxation of overseas Americans. They tend to use it as a somewhat pejorative term to refer to US-based Americans who feel they do not understand their challenges. So Amanda wonders if you could comment on the particular use of this term. Thanks.
Sure, thanks for your questions, Bronwyn and Amanda. Amanda, the simple response is I really wanted to find a phrase that wasn't non-diaspora. Because I'm very, very interested in what domestic citizens have to say about this in terms of the public discourse, in terms of the policy making, as much as I'm interested in what diaspora communities have to say. So I wanted a neutral term that was very germane to the experience of being a homelander. And I came up with the term homelander because many of those who lived in Liberia said that Liberia was the only home that they had ever claimed as their own. Whereas many diasporic interviewees in, for instance, Freetown, Sierra Leone, or Accra, Ghana, or London, United Kingdom, or Washington, United States, had almost a second home. So that's where that term comes from. It was my very, very intentional attempt to ensure that it wasn't a diaspora versus non-diaspora kind of dichotomy. I wanted to give citizens in the country of Liberia a name that was very, very specific to their experience, that wasn't, counter to the diasporic experience, for instance. Bronwyn, your question about the having the passport or the naturalization papers versus the actual experience of citizenship on the ground. I think sometimes what's interesting is, and a lot of citizenship studies scholars such as Yuval Davis, others like O'Connell Davis, have actually demonstrated that citizenship is quite multi-layered and multi-pronged, right? So just by virtue of having the citizenship doesn't necessarily entitle you to having a very similar experience, right? It's experienced differently based on people's social qualifiers, such as their race, their gender, their class, their socioeconomic status, so forth and so on. So I find that even those that I've spoken to who have claimed dual citizenship by law haven't necessarily experienced the institution of citizenship fully, in the same way that Liberians I interviewed who were domestic citizens have argued, pushing back against dual citizenship, that they, even with their single citizenship, have not experienced the institution of citizenship, Liberian citizenship fully, which is one of the reasons why they are so viscerally opposed to enabling people to have 2 or multiple citizenships.
Thanks, Robtel. So we have a question from Lillian Frost. For Daniel, and I saw in the other chat there was also a question by Gijsbert Oom on specific Indian dynamics. So Lily asks about in your research on dual citizenship, she asked to Robtel and Daniel, but I'll ask Daniel to respond to that. Did non-citizen migrant groups living in the state, as opposed to diaspora citizens living abroad, get involved in these debates? Right. So. Are there any strategic alliances in the way between, and maybe that follows up also on the debates that we had about homelander and the resident population and the non-resident population, and maybe Daniel, you could share some thoughts on this. Have you seen any of these kind of strategic alliances, maybe in the Indian case or in any other cases that you have studied?
Thanks, Martin. It's a relatively short answer. And I just to go back to some of the ideas, I think Rainer Bauberg seems to be on the line, and I forgot with whom with another co-author, maybe with you, Martin, correct me if that's the case, studied constellations about how many countries actually are open dual citizenship for the expatriate versus the immigrants, and the kind of cohesion or hypocrisy or whatever, and we definitely see it in the Indian case, right? There was never any discussion about immigrants. India doesn't have a big immigrant community. I'm as good as nobody. I actually wrote a few things on India's immigration policies, and I just did something on India's refugee policies. India has refugees. India doesn't have a refugee policy. India criminalizes refugees. They have specific ideas about Tibetans and Sri Lankan and Tamils, and a very bad policy towards Rohingya right now. But none of these groups is politically strong. And funnily, it's actually sad, but interestingly, in 2003, when the first overseas citizenship was discussed, and Standing Committee on Home Affairs, which for over a year discussed the amendment to the Citizenship Act in its 107th report, they at the same time looked at expanding access to citizenship for refugees who had lived in India for 30 years. And in the same thing, they said, oh, no, we have too many people here. We can't afford to give these people long-term status. We have to send them back at some point. So at the same time, where they said, well, let's embrace the diaspora and give this dual citizenship, which they all call dual citizenship again, by the way, they were very adamant of not expanding access to naturalization and citizenship for a very small, numerically speaking, group of refugees who had been living in India for a long period of time, and sending them back is just like this theoretical idea. So unfortunately, these could not go hand in hand. And if you want to accuse them of an incoherent approach, to use a very diplomatic term, you can. And by the way, Martin, there's also some things like Martin and Gisbert for example, has something in the chat too.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel. So we are running almost out of time. So I wanted to do a last round to give everyone the chance to share their thoughts on this issue. And I realized that there are many things that we could only touch upon, but I hope we gave the audience a sense of some of the interesting research questions that are out there, right? And actually, I think there's a really good research agenda going on, and that's certainly represented by the people here in the panel. But also, I think a lot of room for still, additional research on some of the questions that we discussed. I wanted to ask you also to reflect a bit on what this means for the evolution of the general policy environments. And I'm thinking especially of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that actually doesn't talk explicitly, I think, about the diasporas, and certainly not about the dual citizenship. Is this something in your view that, if you look at how this is developing across the world, that should be more prominent in these kind of global policy debates about migration and development, or is it something that maybe, we shouldn't push too much because it's maybe just a status that actually people perceive differently, and it's maybe in the end not the main driver of some of the developments that we're interested in. So what are your concluding thoughts about dual citizenship and development? So a broad question, and I would be interested in your views on this, and we start with Jen.
So I think probably like most people here, I see dual citizenship as a way of managing many of the tensions associated between its development potential, but also some of the political risks that are potentially brought into the state, particularly in contexts where there may be forms of dissent, or there might be kind of aspects of sort of transnational repression. One of the things that I'm researching at the moment is some of the kind of EU policies around diaspora institutions and around dual citizenship. And one of the things I'm kind of feeling a little bit concerned about is what we could kind of think about as the sort of datafication of diasporas, or the databaseification of diasporas. So what I mean by that is the ways in which there's increasingly amounts of attempts to map, to put into database, to do skills audits, to basically like bring the diaspora into the view of the origin country. And a lot of the ways in which they're doing that is through partnerships with big data organizations and social media organizations such as LinkedIn, creating like employment registers, for instance, of diasporas and auditing their skills. And I'm kind of, I find it a little bit chilling in terms of the ways in which this is increasing the surveillance of the diaspora. So connecting obviously kind of back to governance scholarship around how these kind of techniques allow state to kind of survey the community. It became kind of part of these authoritarian state apparatuses. So just to kind of touch on some of the implications for that, I think there's a lot in terms of to think about there in terms of many of the expectations about that, the ways in which it then gets circulated through different kinds of communities, the ways in which this actually kind of jars with the complex and very hybrid identity formations that people in diaspora have. So just to kind of summarize, I think I'm a very, I kind of see the increasing surveillance of the diaspora as a challenge and something to be kind of really thought about in terms of creating particular kinds of political subjectivity.
Thanks, Jen. Daniel, your brief concluding thoughts?
Sure, thank you. It wasn't really fair to throw the SDGs in there, because I don't know if you know that, but the book I'm writing is about the SDGs and migration. So I could talk about like a year and a half about that. But we published a report by the World Bank, UNDP, and the OECD last year on policy coherence for migration development, in which we actually suggest that in base indicator, 6-7 indicators, measuring, among others, SDG 10.7, which is well-managed migration policies, in which we actually say dual citizenship is a part of well-managed migration policies. Hence, I would say, yes, dual citizenship and diaspora is part of the SDGs, especially 10.7, but others too. I think dual citizenship has, from the development base, very high PR value. Like from a policy perspective, and I work with governments the world over, and like the PR value, how you can engage diasporas, right? And not from a critical perspective right now, but just like from a trust building, from actually engaging with diaspora. Dual citizenship has this unique value that other policies do not have. From a good perspective, it gives rights, right? Like it gives agency, it gives a lot of opportunities to people, so that we want that. But I agree with the point that Jen and Rob had mentioned, that we have to ask who is exercising those rights? What does it mean for inequality? And of course, that is a question that's related to who is the immigrant population, right? Who is in the immigrant diaspora populations actually using these rights in a certain way? And that can't be answered in general, but it's a very specific question. One key question is, how can countries that have heterogeneous and sometimes old and new diasporas fit them in? For example, India, most people in Mauritius are kind of Indian descent, like 95%. Should they all get voting rights eventually in India? Fijian Indians who have been out of the country, they're forefathers, 150 years. They've never been in India for 100 years or longer, right? So what extent should they actually get citizenship? And that's like, even those of us who are in general in favor of dual citizenship think, okay, these people definitely should not get political rights, right? There's definitely a limit. There's something you can embrace them, but then the entire question about when does this embracing becomes just a form of nationalism when it comes, and that's what Diaspora mentioned in his comment in India. To what extent is this embracing of dual citizenship in Indian diaspora a code for the Hindu diaspora? To what extent does it not include Muslim diaspora? And of course, India is one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, just by its sheer size. And many of the Muslim diasporas don't feel embraced, even though formally, of course, they are as much included as any other group. And the last one point to David's point on affinity. I wrote a paper 3 years ago where I said shed blood for love. It could be that all these diaspora engagement policies are in the end just a way of trying to use affinity, right? Diaspora is a group where we assume that they have an affinity, hence we can use a special policy, but we actually want anybody who loves us can invest and come. And India, again, as a spouse of an Indian citizen, I'm allowed to become an overseas citizen. It's one of the most generous policies. So here, love is enough to become an ethnic citizenship person. So sometimes maybe these are just codes in policy, proxies to get to love and not just to blood.
Thanks, Daniel. Robtel, your thoughts?
Sure. I think one of the things I've realized in my research is that the whole debate around dual citizenship and diasporas really brings into greater focus the importance of citizenship governance at the national, local, global levels, and really interrogating this dichotomy between extending rights and extracting responsibilities, right? I really believe fundamentally that we should be thinking about how do we ensure that dual citizenship ensures that there's an extension of rights while also an extraction of responsibilities. There's something that I theorize in my book called the political economy of belonging. What I really mean by this is that socioeconomic transformation really depends on the provision of protections and privileges, what we might deem as rights, and also the fulfillment of duties and obligations, what we might deem responsibilities. And I think within the context of the SDGs, this is precisely what we need to be thinking about, that dichotomy between extending rights while also extracting responsibilities. And the dual citizenship and diaspora conversation forces us to think about citizenship governance in that realm.
Thanks, Robtel. David, you have the floor.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I'm taking notes, and going back and looking at what Jen, Daniel, and Robtel have just said. And I think there's many papers to write here, and lots of questions to ask. I guess I would leave with two thoughts, and they're really not thoughts, they're questions, right? The first question is, as we've been talking about dual citizenship, oftentimes all of us to some extent are drifting into discussions of voting, right? And the extent to which these are, the extent to which, dual citizenship and voting are complements or substitutes, and the times when these rights go together and where they do not. Right, and maybe that may give us some leverage in thinking about the strategies that the different strategies that governments use in terms of thinking about expatriate rights as a development tool or a development strategy. So that's the first thing. The second is, are there other sorts of policy tools that may also influence their government choices as it pertains to the extension of dual citizenship. So if you think about, from my perspective, dual citizenship is a mechanism to increase remittances. Our government's at the same time also trying to recruit global banks, right? Because to encourage their banks to establish international branches, because that might also be a way of enhancing and increasing remittances, right? Because if an expat, a migrant in London sees an Indian bank, they may say, this is going to be an easier way for me to transfer money to my family back in India. And so just thinking about these different ways in which governments engage their diaspora, but at the same time, the different ways in which policies can come into play that allow governments to extend their reach economically and politically. And so again, in that regard, I just think there's so many really interesting questions to ask.
Well, thanks everyone. This has been splendid. I think I really enjoyed it. And I think we have questions for a research agenda for the next 10 years to keep ourselves busy. And I'm sure also the people in the audience and people who will see this later online. Thanks a lot for great speakers. If you want to know more about this topic, do read their work. Which I found very inspirational to read, and I look forward to reading more from all four of you. So thanks a lot, Jen, Robtel, David, and Daniel for sharing your thoughts in this exchange. Thanks a lot to Valentina Bettin for helping organizing this webinar. And thanks a lot, people in the audience, for joining us and sharing your questions. And the next GLOBALCIT webinar will be in a month from now, on Tuesday, the 27th of April. And we'll address the citizenship, migration, mobility nexus. So continue some of these debates, but with a different focus. So I hope to see all of you back there. And thanks again to the speakers of today. Thank you.